All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I figure we'll give us another 30 to 90 seconds to let folks hop on from their previous engagements, and we will get ourselves started. All right. Well, in the interest of not leaving too much dead space, good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to have you here. Want to just take a moment to introduce our session for today. My name is Matt Eckel. I'm the Associate Director of Research here at NCPERS, and I'd love to welcome everybody to today's webinar session, Social Security at 90, a bipartisan roadmap for the program's future. Today, you will hear from Tyler Bond and Rebecca Vallas, and during our webinar exploring Social Security's legacy and its future. Tyler Bond is the research director for the National Institute on Retirement Security. He works with the executive director to plan all NERS research products. And since joining NERS, Bond has authored or co-authored numerous research reports, issue briefs, and fact sheets on a wide range of topics relating to retirement security. He regularly speaks at conferences about NERS research and testifies before policymakers. Previously, Bond spent 4 years at the National Public Pension Coalition. He has also held positions on Capitol Hill and at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He holds a BA in Political Science and Philosophy from Indiana University and an MA in Public Policy from George Washington, and is a member of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Vallas joined the Academy as its Chief Executive Officer in 2024 after spending nearly 8 years as a member of its board of directors, including 4 as secretary. Most recently, she spent 2021 through 2023 as a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, where she founded the organization's disability economic justice work. Prior to TCF, she spent the years 2014 to 2018 helping to build and lead the Center for American Progress's anti-poverty work in a range of different roles. Forever a legal aid lawyer at heart, Vallas began her career representing low-income individuals and families as a legal aid attorney in the Aging and Disability Unit at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia. She received her law degree from the University of Virginia and graduated summa cum laude from Emory University. I'd also, before kicking it over, just like to editorialize when I ran into some of the research that is being presented today just a little bit earlier this year and had the privilege of taking a look at it. Thought it was a really fantastic window into how Americans think about Social Security and think about their broad kind of perspective on retirement as we move into the 21st century. So I, for one, am really excited for today's webinar and hope everyone else is too. And just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will be taking questions in the chat. We also have some questions that were submitted during registration, and we will address those questions once the initial presentation is done. So do please, if you have any, make sure to submit those, and I will try to MC a relatively efficient Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, let's send it over to our speakers. Thank you both for being here.
Great. Well, thanks, Matt, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, and thanks to NCPERS for hosting us on what is obviously a very timely topic. Social Security is always important, but this year has seemed to take on an extra importance given everything that's been happening as the new administration has been implementing its various policies. So really excited to share these 2 pieces of research with you all today. So let me pull up our slides right now so we can start presentation. There we go. Great. So before we get into the specifics of the 2 reports, we just want to, set some ground about Social Security. And it's important to know in the current context that Social Security is funded by ongoing contributions. You'll often hear politicians or people in the media say that Social Security is going bankrupt. But the truth is, Social Security can't go bankrupt, even if the trust funds become exhausted in about a decade. And there is a benefit cut to make up from the lack of revenues from the trust fund. Social Security will still be able to pay benefits. Those benefits will be lower because of the gap between scheduled benefits and incoming contributions, but Social Security will continue to pay benefits going forward. So it's important to acknowledge that at the outset. It's also important to keep in mind, as you would figure from the National Academy of Social Insurance, that Social Security is a social insurance program. It's not structured the same as a defined benefit pension plan, which I know many of the folks joining us today are very familiar with. And it's also not an investment. It's not a savings program like a defined contribution plan, like a 401k. It's a social insurance program. So it's financed differently. The role it's meant to serve in people's lives is meant to be different than either a pension or a 401k plan. And we can talk some more about how those three different components could and do interact with each other. It's also important to keep in mind that Social Security is here for you now. Most of the time, we think about Social Security as a retirement program. And for the majority of its beneficiaries, that's what it is. It is a retirement program. It provides the foundation for retirement security in the United States. But Social Security also provides really important benefits to surviving spouses, to children, and to people with disabilities. So people at any stage of life can and do benefit from Social Security. It's not something you have to wait decades for and only benefit from when you're older and retired from your full-time career. You could benefit from Social Security tomorrow. And again, as I said, Social Security is an important component of retirement income for nearly all Americans. The Social Security Administration estimates that just over 97% of all older Americans will receive some form of Social Security benefit. And Social Security really does form that foundation upon which all of our other retirement income programs like pensions and 401ks are built on top of. And then again, just to reemphasize, disability insurance is a fundamental component of Social Security, and it is meant to be there and play an important role in people's lives, just as the old age and survivors insurance program does. So before we turn to the two reports, I just wanted to give Rebecca an opportunity to add anything else at the outset about Social Security.
Thanks so much for that, Tyler. What a great place to start. And just a big thanks to NCPERS for having us today. It's always fun to get to hang out with Tyler and talk about Social Security. So I'm really glad for the opportunity today to talk about some of this public opinion research. I think, Tyler, you did a great job kind of grounding us in some of the basic facts and things to remember, but some of what I will bring in as well before we get into what Americans think about Social Security, and Matt, as you were noting, kind of how Americans think about this program, this incredibly important program as it marks 90 years. What I would really love to do is also bring in just a little bit of the people side of this, right? We often think about Social Security, and people often, especially in Washington and policy circles, talk about Social Security as though it's a budget problem to be solved, right? But the reason we have this program is because we understand as a society that we care about having protection that's there for all of us when we experience what FDR famously said 90 years ago. He called them the hazards and vicissitudes of life, the kind of life experiences, some of which we can predict, like old age and retirement, and some of which we might not be able to predict when they might happen. Things like losing a loved one or a breadwinner in your family, or becoming disabled and being unable to work. And so something I've been doing a lot of reflecting and talking about this year as we mark 90 years of this cornerstone of America's social insurance system, is really thinking about what did life look like before we had Social Security, which for most of us alive today is a history lesson. But prior to the Social Security Act being signed in 1935, about half of older adults in this country lived in poverty. And virtually all people with disabilities lived in poverty. And many people who experienced old age, who experienced loss of parents or a breadwinner or a loved one, or experienced disability in a way that impacted their ability to work, these were people who ended up often in institutional situations, right, with a poorhouse or orphanages, or at worst living on the street. And so I find it to be really important, as we think about why we have this program, to also remember what things looked like before we put it in place, and before we get into thinking about dollars and cents, and what people want for its future. And Matt, as you noted, here we are talking about its legacy, a lot of what it's done to change the very course of life in America, and really to change the fabric of society, and to create really the cornerstone of our social contract. So that's what I would add in, Tyler, to your really great overview. And to make that comparison, right? If before Social Security, about half of older adults in this country lived in poverty, today that number is just about 1 in 10, right? And that's still more than should be the case, and more than I think Tyler and I would like to be the case. But it's a dramatic set of strides that we've made, as we think about the legacy of what FDR referred to as a cornerstone in a structure which is still being built and is by no means complete. So that's what I'll throw out there as we think about how far we've come, and also, as we'll hear from the American people, how far people still want us to go. So Tyler, over to you, and then I look forward to jumping back in after you go through this great paper.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So we're going to be talking about two different reports today. And I like to think of these reports as siblings. I did help produce both of them, so they're kind of like my Social Security children. So the first report is one that NERS released in January of this year, called Social Security's First 90 Years. And this is a history of polling on Social Security. And I'll talk in a minute about why we thought that this was important to do. The second is the Social Security at 90, a bipartisan roadmap for the program's future report that the National Academy of Social Insurance released, in which NERS, along with AARP and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, were partners in producing that report. And the Social Security's First 90 Years report is kind of a look at the past of how have people thought about Social Security in the past. The Social Security at 90, in some ways, is looking at how people think about it today, but it's really thinking about how people are looking ahead and how they want changes to be made to resolve the financing gap going forward. So there's links to both reports on the slides. The Social Security 90 report can also be found on the NERS website as well as on the Academy's website. So why did we want to do the Social Security's First 90 Years report? So I think this is probably known to everyone on this webinar, but just to say it again, the most recent estimate from the Social Security Trustees report says that if no action is taken, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund will be exhausted in 2033 at some time in that year. It's not January 1st of 2033, but at some point in that calendar year, if nothing changes, that trust fund will be completely exhausted, meaning all the money in that trust fund will have been spent, and Social Security will only have its ongoing contributions to rely on to pay benefits. Now, the Disability Insurance Trust Fund is a separate trust fund. Legally, right now, those are two separate trust funds that cannot be combined. Congress would have to change the law to combine those two trust funds. But the Social Security Trustees report often does a projection of well, how long would the solvency last if those two were combined? And if they were combined, you basically get another year. The most recent report said it would be 2034 when the combined OASDI trust fund would be exhausted. So really at this point, one way or another, we're looking at less than a decade before this financing gap needs to be resolved. Otherwise, there would be across the board benefit cuts for every current and future Social Security beneficiary. And if it's only the OASI trust fund that gets exhausted, the benefit cut for those Social Security beneficiaries would be, I think the most recent estimate was about 24% benefit cut. If it's the combined trust funds, the benefit cut would be about 19% across the board. Regardless, I don't think that's an outcome that really anyone wants to happen. So there's that important question. But one of the things that we notice is that often pollsters ask survey respondents a lot of one-off questions about Social Security, but there's not a lot of sort of trending, how do attitudes change over time, and how do people's attitudes change as they age, as they get closer to being eligible to claim Social Security benefits. So what we wanted to do was to sort of piece that picture together and see what could we find from the available polling that would tell us how have these attitudes changed both over time, but also as generational cohorts have aged. And so we ended up having data that, for the most part, covered the period from 1978 to 2023. So we had about 45 years worth of data to work with. Now, some of that, was kind of spotty. That wasn't consistently covering all 45 of those years. But we felt like it was enough that we could put together some reasonable estimates of what people think about Social Security. And the big finding, and the one that we were the most eager to sort of find an answer to, was, do people become more confident in Social Security as they age? And the answer is yes. Consistently, and I'll show in the slides a few different ways that we document this, but basically, however you kind of look at it, as people and as generational cohorts get older, they express more confidence in Social Security and Social Security being there for them when they retire. And I largely think that that's a function of age, right? When you're in your 20s, you're younger, you have more immediate financial concerns, whether that's paying off student loan debt or buying a house or a car or starting a family. Retirement and old age are decades in the future. So you're just not thinking that much about Social Security. And you might think, oh yeah, Social Security, that's a great program. But it's so far away when I'm going to retire. I don't know if it'll be there for me when I retire, right? But as people spend more years paying into the program, they feel more invested in these benefits that they've contributed to throughout their career, and they get closer to retirement age themselves, then they start to feel more confident that, well, yeah, it's not that far away from me now. When I get there, Social Security will be there for me. I feel confident in that, right? And this happens for generations as well as for individuals. So when the baby boomers were younger, when they were polled in the 1980s, they expressed less confidence in Social Security than they do now. We can see how their attitudes have changed over time. As the baby boomers have aged, their confidence in the program has increased. One thing that we were a little surprised about is that few pollsters directly ask, do you like Social Security? That's just not apparently a very common question. There are other questions we can look at where we can basically deduce from there that yes, people really like Social Security. They have favorable views of it. They think it's an important government program. Some surveys indicate that majorities of the American people think Social Security is the most important government program. But rarely are people asked the direct question, do you like Social Security? Another thing we're going to talk about in the history of polling report that's also relevant for the Social Security at 90 report is that strong majorities believe that more money should be spent on Social Security, and that this is a consistent view across income, educational attainment, political affiliation, basically any demographic cut of the data. The majority believe that we should be spending more money on Social Security. And then we're not going to spend too much time on this today because of our time constraints. But one thing that we did find reviewing the polling data is that there is a disconnect among workers about their expected retirement age. So when people are younger, they think they're going to retire younger. And when people are older, they think they're going to retire older. And we spend a little bit of time in the paper talking about what some of the reasons for that might be. So if you're interested in that question, I would direct you to the Social Security's First 90 Years paper. So as I mentioned, there is this view that too little is spent on Social Security. So the General Social Survey, which has asked this question since 1984, as you can see here, the blue line at the top is too little is spent on Social Security. And with one exception in the mid 1990s, that has been the majority view of GSS respondents basically for 40 years. And it's a view that has increased its share of respondents in more recent years. You'll also note that the share of respondents who say we spend too much on Social Security has always been below 10%. It's never gone above that percentage. So really the only movement has been between people who say the amount spent is about right and the people who say the amount spent is too little. And as I mentioned, this is a bipartisan view. So the GSS allows you to break out the data between Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And again, you see their views are not that different. In fact, the two things I would point out in this chart are, one, if you look at the bottom, Republican respondents have basically been the same as Democrats and independents in saying that in the percentage that say too much is spent on Social Security, where basically all three groups have been at or below 10%. Republican respondents have bumped slightly above that a few times, but not often. And the interesting thing is that among Republican respondents, for a long time, the plurality view was that the amount spent is about right. But recently, Republican respondents have shifted to also say that too little is spent on Social Security, basically bringing them to the same place that Democrats and independents are in the most recent polling. So I think there's a disconnect between how Social Security is often talked about in Washington and what the American people think about Social Security. And Rebecca alluded to this at the beginning of the webinar about the important role that Social Security plays in people's lives. And I think the American people feel that, But as was said, it often becomes just a budget discussion here in Washington. So, as I mentioned, we relied on data from a variety of different surveys, and with different iterations of some of those surveys, we looked at data from over 154,000 respondents across all those surveys. And as I said, covering about a 45-year period. So this is just sort of the methodology that we took. And I should say at this time that my co-author on the Social Security's First 90 Years report was an intern that NERS hosted from the National Academy of Social Insurance last summer, Jacob. Um, Jacob was excellent, was an essential partner on this research. The Academy always has an excellent group of interns every summer. And we've been very fortunate to work with them a couple of times now to host one of their interns. And Jacob really helped make this report happen. So, as I said at the beginning, one of our main things that we wanted to figure out was, do people become more confident in Social Security as they get older? And again, the answer is yes. So this is combining the answers from a few different surveys covering different spans of time. And basically you see we cut the, or we broke the response at 4 different age cuts, 25, 40, 55, and 70. And basically what you see is the older age is always more, excuse me, more confident in Social Security than the younger age. And they generally follow sort of the same up and down trends in confidence over time, but with the older respondents always being more confident than the younger respondents. This is one particular survey, but it did show the question sort of asked it, so you could respond, do you have complete confidence in Social Security or no confidence in the future of Social Security? And what you see, and this will come up again in a couple of the other charts I'll show, is it seems to be about middle age, somewhere 45 to 50-ish is when people start to become more confident in the program. So again, they're younger, they're less confident. By the time they reach middle age, presumably they've been paying in to the program for a while now, then their confidence starts to increase and it really takes off as they get closer to the retirement age and the earliest claiming age for Social Security. Again, a different survey breaking it out into different age categories. This time, the green bars are responses to a 1995 survey. The blue bars are responses to a 2015 survey. And it's showing levels of confidence in Social Security. Again, interesting things to point out. These surveys are 20 years apart and yet very similar responses, right? So not, and if anything, people became more confident in the program over that 20-year period. Also, noticeable increase in confidence in the 50 and above ages, which again is what we would expect to see from the other data that indicates an increase in confidence as people get older. Again, we can break it out by generational cohorts. So here, we had in some of the early surveys from the 80s, we still had folks from the greatest generation being surveyed. They are the light green that's kind of on the left side of the chart. The silent generation actually had a lot of survey responses. They're the blue. The boomers are in the darker green. So again, you see that the older generation typically is always more confident in the program than the younger generation is. You will see that there's a couple of points in the more recent surveys where Gen Z expressed more confidence than millennials or Generation X. We speculate some in the paper that maybe at the very youngest ages, 18, 19, 20, you just are a low information respondent, right? Your actual knowledge of Social Security is not that great when you're that young. And so you might say, oh, yeah, Social Security, my grandpa has that. Great program, right? But then once you start working and you get more in your career, then you probably are going to end up following that usual trajectory of declining and then rising confidence again. But what I would note is this is a pretty consistent pattern over time of the older generations being more confident than the younger generations are. So with that, I'm going to stop for a minute and pass it back to Rebecca. She's going to talk about the Social Security at 90 report.
Thank you so much, Tyler. I really, I feel like that report and that kind of survey that you and Jacob and NERS did of so many decades of polling, it really has been kind of the gift that keeps on giving in so many different ways. And so I know I always enjoy hearing about it, but right, it's almost everywhere one goes. And I'm especially feeling this right now because it's intern season at the Academy. You were mentioning our intern program, and we have a lot of interns this summer. They're just finishing their last week. And there's almost always that question when people hear about Social Security, will it be there for me? Right. And that comes up a lot. And so knowing the consistency across time of the growth in confidence that people experience as they get older and as they realize that it is going to be there for them. That was really an interesting finding to me. But I also always love to say to folks, and I've been, helping educate young people this summer through our internship program as well, as have you and other Academy members, that it's actually there for you now. And so to your point about it being there for disability protections and also for survivor protections, right? Those are important things as well that really mean it's not just there for you later in retirement. So I really love that product. I also want to give a quick plug as we segue into the next report. You mentioned Jacob, the wonderful intern that you worked with on all of that work. And Jacob, among other Academy interns, current and former, is actually going to be speaking at an Academy event next week. It's on August 13th, the day before Social Security's actual 90th anniversary. And it is specifically a whole virtual event by young people for young people, airing Gen Z and millennial perspectives about Social Security. So I think I'll find a link to that and pop it in the chat at some point before this webinar wraps. But if folks are interested in hearing more about what younger generations think about Social Security, that'll be a great opportunity to hear from young folks as we pass the mic and give them the stage. So a great segue into this other survey that Tyler teed up beautifully, which was a partnership between the National Academy of Social Insurance and, as you mentioned, Tyler, also NERS and AARP and the Chamber of Commerce, who we really enjoyed getting to work with on this. And I also want to give a plug to Greenwald Research. They were the firm that actually conducted the work. And so, Tyler, you started with kind of why you did that work, and I'll do the same thing to set this up, which was last year we knew that we were heading into the 90th anniversary of Social Security, but also, as you and I have both said a couple of times today already, the Washington conversation, the inside the Beltway conversation on Social Security is so often about what do policymakers think, or what do folks who are trying to influence policymakers, what do they think? But so relatively infrequently, in DC at least, is the question asked, well, what do the American people want? And so that was what we at the Academy really thought was the place we wanted to start for marking the 90th anniversary, was going to the American people and saying, what do you want for the future of Social Security now that we are increasingly aware that we're going to have an action forcing event. Congress is going to have to do something to address that financing gap that Tyler mentioned. And I'll be the optimist here. Tyler, you were speaking about how there might be a benefit cut in the future if Congress doesn't act. And I'll just say Congress has never failed to act when it's had a financing gap in its trust funds and its ability to pay full benefits. And so I'll go ahead and say I don't have any doubts that Congress is going to do something. The question is just what. And given that there are a whole bunch of policy levers that are available, things like cutting benefits, things like bringing more revenues into the system, we really wanted to take the question to the American people and say, what do you want Washington policymakers to do to address this problem? And that's really the story behind this poll. So Tyler, since you are being our slide person today, and thank you for doing that, I will say next slide. Great. So just a very quick note on methodology for anyone who wants to know, and you can find a deeper dive describing the methodology in the report itself. But the thing that really made this particular survey a little bit different from many of the other surveys, most of the other surveys and polling instruments used to evaluate Americans' attitudes on Social Security, and I'll get into this in more depth momentarily, is that at the heart of it was something called trade-off analysis. So instead of just asking a whole bunch of standalone questions of, do you like this policy? Do you like this policy? We also, as part of this survey instrument, asked people to actually do what members of Congress are going to have to do and put together a package. And we did that through a methodology that is sometimes called conjoint analysis or trade-off analysis that actually asks people to make a series of choices. And so for that reason, we got a little more information about how Americans want policymakers to address the solvency challenge in Social Security than just, do you like this policy in isolation? Do you like that policy isolation? So other methodology details on this screen and also in the report, but I'll skip to the next slide. So some of the first questions that we asked actually had to do with what does Social Security mean to people today? And that was really the baseline we wanted to start from. And what we found was that for virtually all respondents, virtually all Americans, Social Security is hugely important to their income if they're already receiving benefits. Sometimes we will talk about how Social Security is the most effective anti-poverty program in the history of domestic policymaking, and it is, for the reasons that I mentioned when we got started. And something that is less well understood and that this survey really hammered home is that it's not just an anti-poverty program. It's hugely important for people well up the income ladder when it comes to what it means as a retirement security program in old age. So 4 in 5 beneficiaries said it was very important to their monthly income. Only 1% of people that we polled said Social Security wasn't that important to them at all. Next slide. Underscoring that same point, we found that a huge share of Social Security beneficiaries, and this is not people currently receiving benefits, but people anticipating what these benefits are going to mean to them in the future. 2/3 of Americans said they wouldn't be able to afford the basics or would have to make significant lifestyle sacrifices if they didn't have Social Security in retirement. So again, not just important to people who are in poverty, or would be really important to folks who are middle class and up the income ladder. Next slide. So Tyler teed this up beautifully, right? This is a really politically polarized moment on many issues. And it seems sometimes when you read the news or turn on the TV that all we hear about is political polarization. But what we found throughout this entire poll was just immense bipartisan agreement. Maybe this is the only thing Americans can agree on right now. I'm not sure, but it certainly is something that brings people together. And so what we found sound loud and clear. And this really kind of goes to the point you were making, Tyler, about the disconnect between the Washington conversation and the conversation happening around kitchen tables across the US is overwhelmingly across party lines, across generations, across income and education. Americans all said loud and clear, they don't want to see benefit cuts. They want to see revenues brought into the Social Security system to ensure that benefits don't have to be cut and to ensure that the system is put on sound financial footing for the long term. So message to Washington, 85% of Americans said benefits should not be reduced. And maybe even we should increase benefits, even if it means increasing contributions on some or all Americans. Just a tiny share, 15%, said, no, please don't raise Social Security contributions on anybody. I would prefer benefit cuts. So a really loud bipartisan message that we hope policymakers are listening to, given how different this message is from a lot of what you hear inside the Beltway. Next slide. So I mentioned that at the heart of this survey was trade-off analysis, and we're going to segue now into that portion. I sometimes kind of think about this as like we constructed a people's commission. You sometimes hear about commissions working on Social Security or other policies. Well, this was kind of like having a people's commission, and we said, hey, you guys go play Congress and do what Congress is going to need to do. And this type of methodology enables you to do that. So I'm not going to do the whole story that our pollster Matt Greenwald would do if he were explaining trade-off analysis. He would talk about asking people if they want a hot dog or a hamburger or a cherry soda and what they would pay for these things. But suffice to say that trade-off analysis is a specific type of survey methodology that enables you to get a sense of not just people's preferences, but the intensity of their preferences in a way that allows you to evaluate what is the package that people prefer. So if you're into knowing more about this, check out our report. It has a detailed section describing conjoint or trade-off analysis. Next slide. So using that trade-off or conjoint analysis, we gave our respondents a whole bunch of choices. And there were all types of policy options. Some of them were to increase benefits in various ways. Some of them were to decrease benefits in various ways. Some of them were to increase revenues in various ways. Some of them were to decrease revenues in various ways. Every single one of the policy options put in front of people in this survey instrument was something that's been proposed either legislatively or is actively being talked about in Washington. So we weren't making stuff up. We were saying, here's the stuff that's largely being talked about, and let's put this together and give people a set of options. Again, I'll refer people to the methodology section of the report if you want more in the way of a really detailed simulation of how this was done. But people were basically making a series of choices between this package, this package, this package, this package, and importantly, every time people were making choices, they were informed choices. They were provided information about what impact the package would have on the Social Security financing gap. And all of that number crunching was based on the Office of the Chief Actuary at the Social Security Administration. And every time people were given a choice, they also had the option to say no change. So I'm going to go ahead and skip to the next slide and refer folks to the report for a deeper dive on methodology. The options ranged, as I mentioned, from things that would change the revenue structure, things like changing the tax max, things like changing the tax rate. We also looked at raising the retirement age or not, changing the cost of living adjustment, and a range of options for improving benefits as well. And we're going to get to those in depth. So I'm going to skip this for now. So probably what everyone's been waiting for. I feel like there should have been a drum roll for this slide, and that is, what was the preferred package? And I will say this was the preferred package preferred by 82% of respondents to the status quo. And it happens not just to close the long-term financing gap, it also actually provides a slight surplus. So if Congress were to legislate this, they would more than solve Social Security's long-term financing challenge. challenges. And what was in the package, people preferred overwhelmingly. It brings in a whole bunch of new revenue through changing the tax max with a donut hole for people who earn less than $400,000, but people who make more than that having no cap on contributions. So people effectively who are the wealthiest people in the country would pay into Social Security all year round, just like lower income workers. The preferred package also included, and this is one of those sort of busts the conventional wisdom headlines from this survey, people wanted to see a gradual increase in the overall contribution rate itself. Currently, it's 6.2% for both employees and employers. And Americans said, you know what? We hate benefit cuts so much. We want to see and would actually be willing ourselves to contribute more into Social Security year round. And so we saw a preference for a gradual increase in the Social Security payroll tax rate from 6.2% to 7.2% on both sides, employee and employer. People did not want to see the retirement age increase. That's something that gets talked about a whole bunch in Washington. Lots of folks are saying, oh, isn't everyone living longer? Some people are definitely living longer, by and large, people who are higher income and have had less arduous work histories. And the American people said loud and clear, no, we don't want to see the retirement age changed. We did see in the preferred package a desire to include a more generous cost of living adjustment, which some have said would be a more accurate reflection of what inflation looks like for older people. So a more generous COLA. Now, some of the things that were included in this preferred package also were pretty innovative and newer ideas for improving and enhancing Social Security benefits for certain types of households that currently are not as well served by Social Security as others. And one of those was one of Tyler's favorite policies. Sometimes it's called a caregiver credit for people who take time out of the workforce to care for very young children. And if you happen to be someone who has done that, or you know anyone who has, you know that actually means you take a hit on your lifetime Social Security benefit because you don't get work credits for the years that you take that time out of the workforce. So this policy, which is increasingly getting talked about, was very popular, was included in the package, and would give parents work credits for the years that they take time out of the workforce to care for young children. People did not opt to see an increase across the board in benefits for all beneficiaries, something that is being talked about quite a lot in Washington. People did not want to include any change to how benefits are taxed, something that has definitely been getting talked about a lot in recent months. And another innovative idea that's been getting a lot of attention in the last few years, especially as awareness has increased, that older workers who are not able to make it to the full retirement age, which has been increasing in recent years. That was one of the things that was legislated the last time Congress acted to address Social Security solvency back in 1983, was a gradual increase in the retirement age. There is a growing number of older workers who aren't able to make it all the way to full retirement age because they've done a lot of physically demanding work over the years, and they're not able to make it all the way to 66 or 67. And so that idea that made it into the preferred package that people really liked was the idea of a bridge benefit, something that would protect people from that early retirement penalty that happens if you claim at 62 or anytime before your full retirement age, and which can be a huge hit to people's lifetime retirement security. And then lastly, something that also made it into the preferred package, but which of all of these options was not especially popular. It was kind of an even split in terms of people who liked it and people who didn't, was to reduce benefits for people who have substantial non-Social Security income in retirement. And our pollsters' theory on why this made it in was because people wanted to totally close the financing gap and needed to make the math work. And so this kind of squeezed in at the end. So Tyler, I feel like those are the high notes from this poll. The rest of our slide deck has lots of detail about people's individual views on, or people's views on individual policy options, which gives us more color on a whole bunch of these different policies. But I also want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to propose that if you have anything you want to add about key takeaways that you had from this particular poll, why don't you jump in? And then Matt, I'm happy to take questions from the audience. And if folks want to hear more about any of these individual policy options that were super popular or unpopular, we've got extra slides we can hit on to show the bipartisan support and opposition. How's that sound to you, Tyler?
Yeah, that sounds great. Two other points that I wanted to make about this, and you already started to allude to one of those points, which is this proposal not only completely closes Social Security's financing gap, but also generates a small surplus. That was not a requirement of the survey respondents. When they were doing the trade-off analysis portion of the survey, they were not instructed that they had to create a package that solves the financing gap. They could have preferred a package that cut everyone's Social Security taxes and increased everyone's benefits, which would have massively increased the shortfall, but they could have said that's the package we most prefer. But I think people are so strongly opposed to indiscriminate across the board benefit cuts that they wanted a package that completely closed that financing gap. And then the related point is that the way these options are listed here from top to bottom is what had the strongest impact on the preferred package down to what had the lowest level of impact. So changing the taxable earnings cap, which people often refer to as the tax max, that had the biggest impact of anything on people's preference for the different packages, followed closely by the tax rate and the retirement age. Everything below those three was less significant in terms of people's preference for the preferred package in a declining order down to that very last one about the beneficiaries with higher incomes, which our pollster said was basically like a 50-50 toss-up. People could have gone either way on that specific proposal, but he felt like because it helped to fully close that gap, that's why they opted to include it in the preferred package. But I agree with Rebecca that I think moving to questions now would be appropriate.
Yep, let's hand things over to you, Matt. And I know we've walked through a lot, so I sort of feel like let's give people one sentence to take away all of this, and then we can transition. So we from this second poll, looking at what do Americans want for the future of Social Security, the way I like to think about kind of the TLDR, as the kids might call it, is that Americans are united across party lines, education, income, and generations in strong opposition to cutting benefits. And strongly, what they want to see, again, Americans from all walks of life, is they want to see the wealthiest people in this country pay into Social Security at the same rate as other workers, and they are willing to pay more themselves to strengthen the program's finances. And that really is the message that the American people wanted to deliver through this survey to folks in Washington. So, Matt, what questions do we have?
Great. Well, thank you both for a really fantastic presentation. We do have a few questions that I hope will kind of add to this discussion a little bit. So one question that we got, actually a kind of a pair of related questions that we got that I think I'll bring up at the same time. Will the financing debate ultimately put the repeal of WEP and GPO at stake, meaning possibly reversing that law? And if that's the case, this was a question from the audience, do you expect any of this data to shift, especially the depletion date with the repeal of GPO/WEP?
So the 2025 trustees report did include the repeal of WEP and GPO in their analysis. And basically what the trustees report said was that the repeal of WEP and GPO moved up the exhaustion date of the trust fund by about 6 months. So as I said, the estimate is at some time in 2033 is when the OASI trust fund will be depleted. The repeal of weapon GPO advanced it by about 6 months within that year. Now, as to the other question of, could, there be mandatory Social Security coverage imposed on public employees as part of whatever final package Congress negotiates? I mean, it's really hard to tell, right? Um, you know, when it comes down to, all the very intense negotiations that are going to happen at the end of the day to get this thing done, what makes it in, what doesn't, is going to depend so much on, who's in office at the time, who's at the negotiating table at the time, what are the broader things happening that are relevant to Social Security. The one thing I would say, though, is, and I think this is related to how the Social Security Fairness Act got passed, when you looked at who had power and who was able to help move that legislation, it's because the states that were most affected were a mix of deep blue states and deep red states, right? So it was easy to put together a bipartisan coalition in support of the Fairness Act because you were getting legislators from Massachusetts and California, as well as Louisiana and Ohio. So for me, I don't see how you build the same type of bipartisan coalition on the other side of it. But again, this is probably going to be, 7, 8 years from now before this gets worked out. Who knows what the politics will be at that time.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would say is, I mean, Tyler, your answer was great. I mean, I left my crystal ball at home, so I can't predict whether we're going to see pressure on repealing the weapon GPO repeal as we get closer. But there also are other factors that a lot of experts, including Academy members, many of whom were sharing in a webinar that we recently did with the Social Security Chief Actuary, Karen Glenn, looking at the 2025 Trustees Report and its projections. There are other factors that some experts are starting to point to that they're also identifying as potentially at risk of further hastening the X date, the insolvency date. And some of those include things like ongoing immigration policies, tariffs. There are a range of different things going on that folks within the Social Security sphere are starting to say these things might impact the reserve depletion date as well, and also not contemplated by the 2025 Trustees Report because it happened afterward, but the recent big bill that was passed and enacted also is expected to hasten reserve depletion because of an impact it's going to have on Social Security's trust funds. And so just to all of this, I think, makes even more important the anchoring ourselves in what Americans want from policymakers, given that as much as it seems like it might be a far off conversation that we're going to be having around what do we do about Social Security, it's not that far from now. And many people are starting to say we're kind of already in the early edge of that debate.
Great. Well, so we had one question sort of broadly about what must need to happen, what changes must take place to make the Social Security Trust Fund sustainable. I think we've discussed a number of potential options over the course of this webinar, but I will take a point of parliamentary privilege and ask my own question here about the conjoint piece. You mentioned that, there were trade-offs that were presented, including in terms of the funding gap. So when survey respondents saw the different packages between which they were choosing, did that choice indicate essentially what that did or didn't do to either close or exacerbate the funding gap? And so that was one of the things that they were considering as they're making a three-way choice.
That's absolutely right. And it is one of the things that sets this particular poll apart from a lot of the other types of polling instruments, because people were fully informed as they were making those types of choices. It wasn't just, do I like this? Does this sound good? It was also with full awareness of fiscal impact, right? Of the impact on the trust funds. And so yes, that was one of the core reasons we wanted to do this polling.
Very good. Well, I think that brings us to pretty much full coverage of questions that folks have, as well as just about to time. So I want to be respectful both of y'all's time and of that of our audience. Just want to reiterate how grateful we all are for our amazing speakers, for everybody who showed up today to participate in a really great webinar. And just wanted to extend thanks from NCPERS, and give you all a chance to say your goodbyes, so to speak.
Thanks so much for having us. And Tyler, always fun to spend time with you.
Yeah, Rebecca, great to talk about Social Security with you. Matt and NCPERS, thank you for hosting us. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I think we will close out. Thank you, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you on the flip side.